about action, knee violence on our programming. It is not of a concern to the public we serve. Now, that may be reflective of the programming schedule of the stations we operate, for we have concern that we do offer our marketplace a schedule that with consistency, that they know what to expect, and that we don't bring surprises to them. But as a broadcaster, I'm just not aware that that violence is really a subject of concern to the citizens. There are programs with action, but violence, it becomes another matter.
When you say violence is not a concern of citizens, have you read even one of these studies that shows that there is a real relationship between violence in our society and what we do?
I have read, I have not checked that table today, but I'm sure those things that I have read undoubtedly are amongst the exhibits that you have there. And over the years, as various studies have come through our trade press medium, yes, I have read them, because we are concerned as to what we do in the local marketplace, which I find the other broadcasters I sit with are equally concerned over that. There are times when some of these studies have come by, which I look at them and I raise questions in my own mind as to the criteria under which these studies were conducted, and what the definition of violence is, whether it is the violence of a comedic sense or the violence of fury, or whether it is something that, well, I can give you an example. There was a list a number of years ago of the 10 supposedly most violent shows on television. Number 2 on that list was a show entitled Sarah. Sarah was a CBS program. It was CBS's response to Little House on the Prairie. It was a series built around a frontier schoolmarm and her struggles in that environment. In going back through the research, it turned out that the episode used for this study, the storyline was the schoolmarm having been kidnapped and taken to the hills by a disgruntled citizen, and in the course of the whole hour, she turns him around and brings him back to town a new person. But under the definition of violence, the act of kidnapping was a violent act, therefore for the entire hour. This was labeled as a violent program, and came up as number 2 on the list. And I look at that and say, there's something wrong here when we can take that kind of definition and raise a flag over a show whose total thrust was that of care and concern.
But what we suggest is that we turn it over to you, that you in the industry do it. And I would add, I hope you don't hide behind this phony shield of definition. Other nations have very clearly defined what is violent. And I think that is not going to be a problem. And it does seem to me, when you say you're concerned about how they define violence and so forth, now there are several studies that relate teenage suicides with the depiction of teenage suicides on television. When you have something like that, it does seem to me that some restraint, voluntary restraint, on the part of your industry is in order, and that you ought to be able to get together, not with the club of government, but on a voluntary basis, without violating the antitrust laws, to come up with standards that protect our society a little better. Senator Thurmond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McGovern.
I definitely state that I do not feel that on network television today there is excessive or gratuitous violence. There is action, but not excessive or gratuitous violence.
In other words, you don't admit then that there's violence on television to any extent?
Depending on the definition of the word violence. Excessive or gratuitous? No. Broad context, and those studies right there, almost every one of which is using a different definition of what violence is when studying. It is difficult to simply say that
Television don't take it off. Now, I'm gonna do all I can to make you take it off if you don't take it off. Now, you also state that the local television affiliates has the right to preempt internet wave program that is deemed objectionable. I'm affiliate to the affiliates use.
each affiliate would use their own guidelines individually. In our case, there was a specific case several years ago where we did elect to drop a series because I enjoy and deeply respect the industry. I am sitting here as a representative of one affiliate board of over-the-air broadcasting. I would like to make that distinction, over-the-air television. And on that basis, for our statement,
advertise, and that's not good. And this violence on television is not good. If you go to the bottom of it, it's simply because somebody wants to make money out of it. You might as well face it. Now that's what it's all about. And if you're interested in...
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think my opening statement was really astonished. Here, Mr. Bartle's statement feels that nothing is necessary. There already exists an effective system of institutional safeguards and marketplace checks and balances. Well, let's focus on that. With all due respect, we're neighbors, you and I. Yes, you live, or at least you conduct business in the state of Maine.
One, the definition accepted by just about everyone. Violence is physical harm to others or the threat of physical harm. That pretty much is in agreement. So the definitional...
in this regard, we're talking about specific episodes of specific series or mini-series and what actually gets on the air and scenes and so forth. That's part of the mechanism of checks and balances. The next step in the mechanism of checks and balances is the relationship between the affiliates and the network, which is an ongoing relationship from the very beginning of network television. As to what we...
That may be so in theory, but it's not working, in my opinion. Again, I ask, what is this review process at the level of the network? So let's take the first level and start. What is that review process? They review each episode, and so...
Specifically, I can't respond to that, Senator, because I run local stations, and we deal, on the affiliate board, we deal with their department heads, and we ask them questions, we discuss things, how they internally operate. I can't respond to that.
Well, as a member of the affiliate board with access to some of the important executives of the network, still you...
The basis, I believe here is that in fact, let me just quote NBC investigator Ralph Daniels, who heads up the standards and practice. And he says, we will continue to apply standards 1, which assume there might be a causal relationship, and 2, which meanwhile assure the depiction of violence is handled with special care by NBC. In other words, there is no arrogance sitting here saying all of that does not mean anything. It's entirely possible that to one degree or another it certainly does. And with that possibility, care is taken and checks and balances are there. Other than over-the-air broadcasting. And I'm only here representing over-the-air broadcasting.
I think we understand that distinction. It's an important distinction.
On thick volume of that. In fact, in my office is, I think, a reference copy of a network, and I don't know which one.
What you regard as an effective system of safeguards, the affiliate relationship. And for how many years have you been in such a position?
Almost 15.
15 years, you've found only one program or one series?
It was one limited series.
of how many episodes?
It was limited because the audience didn't respond to it, so it was probably 7 or 8 episodes. And in its repeat cycle, we did not carry it.
Well, that certainly demand for violence. That does not seem to me that is justification for offering it on a wholesale basis. It seems to me that the television industry, whether on the air, whether
Which part you're referring to?
you used to,
Over-the-air television?
whether it's over the air or cable or whatever, it seems to me you ought to recognize you have a very, very special and unique responsibility.
Including Terry Mahoney of NBC, suggested that I take a look at your process. And so I flew out to Los Angeles, visited all 3 networks. And because I don't know Los Angeles that way, I told my staff to hire a car and get a driver to get me around Los Angeles. So happened that the driver was a woman who was Swedish by background. And I explained to her why I was out there. And she said, you know, in Sweden, while we permit frontal nudity, we do not permit anything like the kind of violence that you have on your television. She said, I was just shocked when I came over to the United States and saw what's on television here. And a few weeks after I was out in Los Angeles, Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, was killed on the streets of Sweden. And what really struck me was down about the 10th paragraph of the story saying, this is the first time in Swedish police records that any Swedish citizen had been gunned down on the streets in Sweden. Now, I'm not saying there is a complete relationship, but if I were in the television industry, I would at least think that maybe we ought to be taking a look at what we're doing to our society. Second, when you quote a television executive in testimony from last year saying there might be a relationship between television and violence, let me tell you, the Surgeon General of the United States says there is a relationship. The National Institute of Mental Health says there is a relationship. The American Academy of Pediatrics says there is a relationship. Study after study after study. When on national television there is a movie presented which includes a young man committing suicide, and after the presentation of that movie, 31 young men around this nation commit suicide in the same way, that is not simply an accidental coincidence. There is a relationship. And finally, when you talk about marketplace checks and balances, what takes over is what my friend Senator Thurman talked about, greed. Profit is what motivates marketplace checks and balances. What we're really asking the TV industry is to have a little higher standard than marketplace checks and balances. We don't mean to be unloading on you, but we appreciate your being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen.
The next witnesses will be a panel. Dr. Eli Rubenstein of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Dr. Letha Houston, co-director of the Center for Research on the Influence of Television in Children. We're representing the American Psychiatric Association, Professor Robert Kuby of Rutgers University, and Dr. Lillian M. Beard of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And we will enter your full statements in the record, and we would ask you to summarize in 5 minutes, if you will, your testimony, and then so we can have the opportunity for questions. Dr. Rubenstein, we will start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at this hearing. My name is Eli A. Rubenstein. I am adjunct research professor in mass communications in the School of Journalism at the University of North Carolina. I am also on the faculty of the Bush Institute for Child and Family Policy at the same university. From 1969 to 1972, I served as Vice Chairman of the Surgeon General's Research Program on Television and Social Behavior. During those 3 years, I was the senior federal official in charge of that effort. I also served from 1980 to 1982 as one of the 7 senior advisors to the National Institute of Mental Health on the preparation and publication of the 10-year update to the original Surgeon General's report of 1972. I continue to remain involved in the research area concerned with the effects of television on the young viewer. I have a brief statement. I would also like to submit for the record a chapter from a book I have recently published. In this chapter, a colleague of mine and I summarize the research on the effects of television on children.
We will enter that in the record.
Thank you. We pay special attention to the research on the effects of televised violence on children. In my brief remarks, I would like to address 3 related questions. First, what do we as scientists know about the effects of televised violence on children? Second, what, if anything, should be done about this problem? And third, who should be responsible for making any necessary changes relating to this issue? As you know, there has been public concern about the effects of televised violence on children ever since the early days of commercial television. However, extensive research did not begin until almost 20 years ago. In the past 15 years, hundreds of scientific articles have been written. While there is no unanimity of opinion, the great majority of scientists in the field believe that there is a causal relationship between televised violence and later aggressive behavior in children. To be fair to those scientists who disagree with this consensus, 2 points need to be made. First, there have been some major studies which did not find this relationship. One in particular, published in 1982, was an extensive field study done by scientists at the National Broadcasting Company. They concluded that their study, and I quote, did not find evidence that television violence was causally implicated in the development of aggressive behavior patterns among children and adolescents over the time periods studied, close quote. The second point to make is that even when the relationship is found, it is generally a weak effect. That means that not a large proportion of the audience is influenced, and even for those affected, it is not always a major impact. With those qualifications, let me repeat that most scientists working in this area, myself included, believe that televised violence does contribute to later aggressive behavior in children. As for the weak effect, there are over 50 million viewers below the age of 16. If only 1/10 of 1% of those young viewers are adversely influenced by televised violence, we are talking about 50,000 children. That is a potentially serious problem that continues to deserve national attention. One of the many important sources of evidence for this conclusion is to be found in an extensive longitudinal study done by Dr. Leonard Aaron and his colleagues at the University of Illinois. Dr. Aaron has been following one sample of subjects for almost 25 years. In a series of re-examinations over the years, including one of the major studies for the original Surgeon General's report, this team of scientists has consistently found a significant relationship between heavy TV viewing and later aggressive behavior in the viewers. Indeed, these researchers have found similar results in a series of cross-cultural studies done in Australia, Finland, Israel, the Netherlands, and Poland. I note, incidentally, that Dr. Raoul Huesman, one of Dr. Aaron's senior colleagues, did testify before this committee last year, so you have already been made aware of this extensive body of evidence. In the 10-year update to the Surgeon General's report published in 1982, the conclusion was reaffirmed that televised violence was causally related to later aggressive behavior by those children who were heavy viewers. Furthermore, it is now believed that there is a vicious cycle in which these children who have been made more aggressive by their viewing habits tend to watch even more violence to justify their own behavior. Let me add another word about the 10-year update. Those of us who were closely involved in the development and publication of that report were not primarily concerned with the issue of televised violence. We were convinced, knowing that study after study had reaffirmed the original causal connection described in the Surgeon General's report, that televised violence was a real and continuing...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you could summarize the balance, we're going to have to be very strict on our 5-minute time because we took more time with the first witness than we originally did.
Okay, let me turn then to suggest that if we accept the scientific evidence, what should we do about it? And having watched congressional committees, I believe we must avoid two pitfalls. One extreme is to do nothing. The other extreme is to impose some government regulation. In one sense, that we have been doing nothing and accepting by default the industry's assurance that this is really not a problem. To attempt the other extreme of government control would rightly be doomed to failure because of First Amendment constraints. It seems to me that the attention of the bill, which is here under consideration, steers an appropriate course between these two undesirable alternatives. It allows the industry to pool its very considerable creative and administrative resources to address this problem of televised violence. By allowing for collaboration on a voluntary basis, the bill also sets a very positive tone for constructive change rather than merely imposing arbitrary constraints on the creative process. The industry leaders have the capacity to solve this problem if they worked at it together, and I would endorse the bill. I would hope that if the bill is passed, the television industry would be required to make annual reports summarizing their progress. This would keep public attention on this matter. And finally, I would like to just quote a section from a paragraph in the chapter that I have submitted for the record.
I hate to say it, we're going to enter that quote in the record.
All right,
here,
then let me just say that I think that this bill allows a combination of attention by the public, concern by the government, and hopefully action on the part of the industry. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much for your testimony. Dr. Houston.
Yes. I'm Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm honored to be here representing the American Psychological Association to testify on this topic. I'm professor of human development and psychology at the University of Kansas and have been for the last 10 years the co-director of our Center for Research on the Influences of Television on Children, which has an acronym CRITIC. I am also chair of the American Psychological Association's Task Force on Television and Society.